Hey, everybody. I wanted to welcome you to this week's real estate meetup group, where the whole goal is to educate you and learn more about the real estate investing process so you feel confident in investing and beginning your investment journey or continuing through and adding more properties to your journey. Today, what I want to talk about is wear and tear versus tenant damage and what that looks like, how to apply it, and what things may not be wear and tear. And so just kind of going through what that looks like. When we get into investing in real estate, we've got tenants who are going to be coming into the property. We've got them staying for maybe as little as 6 months to a year. And there are times when they wind up staying, which is a good thing, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And so when we look at the big picture of when we go back in and do our move out walkthrough and assess for when we can get it ready for a re-rent, we need to evaluate what it looks like compared to when they moved in. And there's a lot of things that go into play for wear and tear versus actual tenant damage. And that's what we're going to take a look at. First, as you may know, when you find tenant damage, things that can be used against a tenant in repairs, you can deduct that from the security deposit. One thing to keep in mind is that you have to have paid invoices of these things. So these can't just be damages that a tenant did that you want to just get reimbursed for without actually repairing the property to what it needs to be. So paid copies of the invoices is what needs to follow the statement of deposit that you're giving your tenant in order to recoup that money. So the security deposit is going to be used for that. It cannot be used when it looks like you're just trying to improve the property and fix some normal wear and tear that might not have actually happened from the tenant. So let's talk about what the difference is. Normal wear and tear means the deterioration which occurs based upon the use for which the rental unit is intended, without negligence, carelessness, accident, or abuse of the premise or equipment, chattels by the tenant or members of its household or their invited guests. So when you look at that, then you would talk about the difference. So damage would then be defined as deterioration which occurs due to negligence, carelessness, accident, or abuse of the premise or equipment by the tenant or member of its households. So some other things that we would be able to add into potential damage is when we are talking about when a tenant moves in, the property is clean and ready for them. We also require prior to a tenant moving in, carpets be cleaned professionally. So when a tenant moves out in their lease, it dictates that they also need to have the carpets cleaned professionally in order to get our full security deposit back. So as long as it's clearly defined of what their expectation is moving in and out, you can charge those things. For us, when we have those expectations set, if we don't have a copied invoice from them that they have the carpets professionally cleaned, we will have it done and charge it back to them. So distinguishing the differences. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over a list of things that, even if it's unintentional versus intentional, that we can charge back to the tenants and what that looks like versus your wear and tear. Also, please keep in mind that, as it says, courts have also ruled that the length of time a tenant has occupied a property must be taken into consideration when assessing the damages. If there is severe wear and tear on a property within a year of them being there versus that same amount of wear and tear for somebody being in the property for 10 years, the courts will adjust what that looks like. Heavy wear and tear could potentially be tenant damage in that 1 year versus that same amount of wear and tear, if it was spaced over a course of 10 years, would not be considered the same as the damage. So different wear and tear options. We've got small nail holes caused by, the small penny nails used for hanging pictures. Now for us, in our lease, we don't allow any holes in the wall and we don't allow pictures on the wall. It also will depend on what your lease says and what they agreed to. But definite damages would be large holes from hanging shelving, pictures, all of those things. If they put one of the flat screen TV brackets. Faded paint and wear and tear is just based on the life expectancy of paint. Sometimes there might be some scratches on the wall, but if it's just from living, moving and not on purpose or specific scrapes, then that would still be considered wear and tear. Versus if they try to spot paint and it didn't work, patching, touch-up paint of any kind, those things would all be considered damage. Major damage also for us would be if they painted the property without our permission or consent. Our lease, it does not allow for them to paint. So we had a tenant one time decide that he was going to paint one of the bedrooms bright pink, and then he didn't move the color back to what it was when he moved in. And the courts did decide that that was considered damage to the property because when he moved in, the paint colors were neutral base. So putting it as a bright pink would not be a re-rentable availability for us to do. So we were able to get the funds in order to reimburse for painting. Hard water deposits, things like that. You're going to see, through time in your bathroom, different stuff. The buildup of dirt and mold and mildew or water stains that's preventable would be considered damage because in our lease, even though those things happen, because they can be preventable and they were unreported, those situations could be avoided and potentially less damaging. So if they had been reported, that would have just been a normal wear and tear. That would have been on the owner's side that they needed to do. But because in this situation where it was unreported, they need to then make up for it because they did not let us know so that we could adjust the situation right when it was happening. The same type of situation for us with mold. Mold can be a very serious issue when it comes to tenant habitability and what that looks like. For us in our lease, it clearly dictates that if a tenant is claiming that there is mold in the property, it would be the tenant's responsibility then to get a mold test done from a reputable company. It cannot be an at-home test. So they would need to pay for the mold test from a reputable company, and then we would get the results. What that looks like is if the results come back where the mold levels are high, and that's what the mold company says, we would not only reimburse the tenant for the amount of money that they had to pay for the invoice to get that work or the test done, but also we would be working with the owner or the landlord of the property in order to get the repairs done to mediate the issues causing that mold. Some more examples of what wear and tear look like. Worn out keys versus broken, lost, or unreturned keys. For us, we give each of our tenants 2 keys unless there's more adults that occupy the house. But in a normal situation, they get 2 keys. So if we don't get 2 keys back, that is considered damage and that would be reported on their statement of deposit and charged to them. Loose or stubborn door locks, that's just wear and tear of a property versus if they're breaking the lock or it's missing. Same with loose hinges, worn carpet, and traffic patterns. Now, this can be a tricky one because we'll talk in a little while about what a normal life expectancy is on some of the things in the property, but worn carpet's only got a certain life expectancy. So if it's worn and the tenant's only been there maybe 1 year, that might be a little bit more of damage versus if it's worn and the carpet's been in place for 8 years. There's a lot of things. And you also have to realize when you accept a tenant into the property, you have to understand. So we've had situations where we've had a 4-bedroom house. And at the time, 2 people living there, there was no pets. So the wear and tear of 2 people versus allowing the next tenants that were there, it was a family of 5 and 2 dogs that were accepted. The wear and tear on a family of 5 with 2 dogs is going to be significantly higher than what it was when there was just 2 people living there. Chances are, they're like a lot of people, they probably didn't even use half the rooms in the house because it was just the 2 of them. However, that family of 5 could have used all of the rooms and used them on a regular basis. That still would be considered their wear and tear versus damage just because you have to factor in how many people and how much use the space has got. Now, we did have a situation, actually, I think it might have been the same property that I was just talking about, where they wound up gouging the hardwood floor. And so there's a fine line between faded finish, scratches on the floor, and then gouges, and what that looks like and how much it costs to replace. Sometimes when you're talking about hardwood floor, the minimum amount that someone would charge for a hardwood floor refinishing might be up to $1,000. So you would have to spend $1,000 in order to get that done. But the courts probably would only allow and accept that small portion of it. So there are times where it might not seem fair or you might not get the full amount, and they just take into consideration all the factors that go into it. So understanding that is really important. linoleum and being worn and thin versus worn countertops. That is definitely different than if a tenant is putting something really hot on the countertop and they wind up burning it or staining it if it's a different type of material. Drywall cracks from settling versus holes in the wall. These are all wear and tear. And be careful when we're talking about drywall cracks and cracks potentially in the foundation. These are all things that would need to be addressed right away, even if a tenant was in the property. So just once again, trying to remind you to do your checks on the property. What we do is we do a move-in inspection, and then every either quarter or half a year, depending on the types of property, we are going back in and doing another full evaluation. We'll also do an evaluation on the property before we offer a lease renewal. So that way we're constantly getting in the property. Also, every time we have maintenance go in there, not only are they fixing the issues that they know that they're going there for, but we just have them kind of do a quick walkthrough, not necessarily invading in their space, but just as they're walking the property, if they notice anything that might be out of sorts. They all have access and understand what our lease is. So they also know what may or may not be allowed, and they could be our eyes and ears as well. So just getting constant eyes on the property really help alleviate not only the wear and tear and understand what you might have at the end of that lease, but potential damages that you might be able to spot early on versus waiting till it truly becomes an issue. Loose wallpaper versus actually ripped or broken, marked up wallpaper. We've had people, and a lot of this winds up being tenants that we didn't place. It was tenants that the owner had when we took over. So we've got a lot of stories with that, but we've also seen kids wind up taking crayon and drawing pictures all over the walls, different things, stickers all over the walls. And that takes some time to clean up, get the stickers off, and then repaint. And that will all be considered tenant damage. Mini blinds broken or worn, or broken would be considered damage versus worn. Torn or missing screens versus just dirty. I had a situation, and you have to remember, we've had some owners, and I actually was one of them back in the day, who used to live at the property, and then they've turned it into a rental. So their attachment to the property is a little more significant than just a standard investor. So they're going to look at everything with that fine-tooth comb, and they're just going to really dive in and really want the property to be back in the condition that they might have had it in when they lived. And while I understand their thought process, because it was my original thought process when I first started, it's not the same, and you can't expect someone. I live in a very certain way, but I also know I can't expect any of my tenants to live the same way I do, where you can walk into my house and potentially it could be shown for sale. I just like to keep it clean, but I know that I can't offer or expect that from my tenants. They live a certain way, and as long as the property is being maintained, it doesn't necessarily need to be to my level of cleanliness while they're there. However, when they leave, it is expected for it to be clean, broomed, swept, with no holes in the wall, no crayons on the wall, and also with if I have any carpet, or if any of our investors have carpet in the property, having that professionally cleaned. The big thing we've got here is damage. So musty odor is one thing. If you've actually not heard of an ozone generator, I've got several of them, and what we do is we wind up putting them in a unit that might have an odor after a guest or tenant. I use them on my Airbnbs as well. The musty odors and all of those things, you can wind up getting a majority of that smell out if you use an ozone generator. So keep that in mind. Also, do not be in the property while that's running. It sucks all the oxygen out of the property, which is how it helps get the smell out, but you don't want to be there. So you want to let it run maybe for a 24-hour period, depending on how strong the smell is. Go back in, turn it off, open up the windows, let it air out, and then you can go back in and do what you need to do. But you'll end up with a pretty bad headache if you decide to stay in there. But urine and pet odor throughout the unit is definitely considered damage. What I'll say about that is we do allow pets in our units. However, we screen our pets very thoroughly. We've actually got a whole nother system set up to screen the pets, make sure they are who they say they are. We've got so many that sometimes have tried to sneak in pets that they say is a cockapoo and winds up being a pit bull. So we verify through pictures, through vet documents, make sure they haven't been an aggressive dog, all of those things. But what you can't necessarily catch is knowing what type of animal it is inside the house with pet odor and urine. What I will say is we also offer a pet fee that would help offset the cost of what that looks like to potentially repair. For our owners, we do go further and offer them a pet guarantee. So if we're placing a tenant with a pet, we take it further and we offer them a guarantee up to $1,500 towards the pet damage. So there's a lot of things that you can set in place for what it looks like to, mitigate some damage with the pets. We'll, go through this a little bit more, but we've got, bifolds, non-functioning smoke detectors or CO detectors. One thing I'll say, and that is wear and tear. But one thing I'll say is depending on your lease, what it looks like for light bulbs and, batteries in the smoke detector, those types of things in our lease is standard that the tenant is responsible for during the life of their lease. Now, when they've moved in, it is our responsibility to make sure it is there and up to code. And then through the life of their lease, light bulbs, batteries, those types of things are all their responsibility. So we just go through, lawn care, all of those things, and that goes into that. So what I want to talk about now is what it looked like if you also have oil tank or if there's fuel that needs to be done. What we do is we always document what it looks like for what the property is when a tenant's moving in. So if the oil levels are at max or at half or 3/4, a photo is taken, timestamped so that they see at the beginning of their lease, and the tenant is responsible for that. So when they move out, it needs to be at the same level as when they moved in. And if not, you get it filled, and then the difference portion is what they're responsible for. So I think you guys see my screen now. So this goes over the estimated life expectancy, and I'll kind of just go through this quick or I'll scroll and let you see, but some of the things that, are important to look at. One big thing is appliances, what it looks like for the air conditioner, HVAC system. Now, for us, we've got actually HVAC filters delivered to our tenants on a quarterly basis. So it goes right to their door so we can know that they're getting them, and then it's on them to put them in the system. And they're dated and everything. So when we go and do our inspections, we will know if it is the most current filter that is supposed to be in there. So one of those things are being proactive and making sure that they are taking care of the equipment the way that it should. And if that's the case, then these, the air conditioned units and all those things, life expectancy should stay pretty standard. And if it winds up being that the tenant hasn't maintained the property or taken care of the filters or has just been really dirty and things are just building up, some of those potential issues could result back to tenant damage because of their negligence. So, looking through here, the different years, dishwashers, dehumidifiers, dryer vents, all of these things. And if at any point you want a copy of this property chart, just let me know and shoot me a message with your email address and I can send it over. But to keep in mind when we're talking about life expectancy of some of these features, just because you have to replace it once again does not mean that that is tenant damage. It does not mean you can charge it against the tenant unless specifically, for example, bathroom cabinets should last you a long time. Even if they're old and outdated, doesn't mean that it'll be damage that the tenant has to pay for. If it's old and outdated and you just want to replace them, that is going to be an owner cost to you. However, if they put a huge hole in the door or scraped it all up, replacing the door or getting the door fixed would be considered tenant damage. So just a lot of things for you to be able to take a look at. I'm not sure if we've seen carpet yet or not, but when you look at the life expectancy of different things and then you see the damage, sometimes what they're going to do is they're going to back the number out of how old the specific thing is, like carpet, and what the expectancy of carpet is versus how old the carpet actually is versus the amount of cost that the damage has been. So it's a big formula that goes into it in order to make sure that everyone is fairly being charged and you're accurately getting the amount of money that you should for the damage. For example, I've seen cases where an investor has decided not to replace the carpet. The carpet is very old at this point, well past its life expectancy. And then a tenant happens to come in and put damage to the carpet. I've seen cases when that has been the case, and then they've gotten no money or very little bit of money for the actual damage to replace the carpet because it's already past its life expectancy. So there's a lot of just different things in here. So yeah, different flooring. Once again, carpet, 8 to 10 years. So if someone is damaging the carpet and it's already been, a decent length, you might not be getting the full amount of money that you're actually going to pay for a carpet replacement. So as you can see, there's just a lot of things that go into what it looks like for life expectancy and how to handle that. Garage doors. We've had people not give us back garage door openers or damage the actual garage door. It's a lot of stuff that, gets a little tricky when you want to decide on what is tenant damage, how much to charge them, and that kind of stuff. One of the things that we can also talk about is when you're taking all of these deductions out of the property, as I mentioned before, and what that looks like is to make sure you're properly recording it, that it's actually the work's actually getting done. I would highly recommend making sure you have before pictures of what the actual damage is versus the repair damage. And then that's not all that needs to be factored into the security deposit that you're giving back. You've also got the interest that goes into that. So what you're going to do is you start with the top line of what the security deposit is, and then you start deducting out if there's cleaning that needs to be done, if there is the oil or anything that needs to be replaced that a tenant didn't do, if there is the carpet cleaning by our lease that's required if that didn't get done. All of those things you start backing out once you have the paid invoices. Depending on where you are, you've got a different time frame in different states on when you have to give it back. Here in Maryland, we're 45 days. Also, you have to figure out what the interest is. If they've been in the property for over a certain amount of time, you are required to give them interest. If you're in Maryland, once again, they've got a really good security deposit calculator through Maryland Association of Realtors, and you can just type that in and type in security deposit calculator, and it comes up. What it does, especially if you've got a tenant who's been there for a long time, there's been different laws in place for how much they're allowed to get in interest. And by using their calculation, it's really good because it breaks it down and truly gives you the accurate number. And so you don't have to think about what that looks like and how it might change and differ depending on each situation. So we use that a lot. And then we wind up taking that, backing it out of the security deposit along with the damages if there are any. And then that's the number that the tenant gets back. On the flip side, if their damages are more than what it looks like for their security deposit, then it's a matter of what it looks like in order to try and recoup that money. If it's only a little bit over, it's completely up to you if you want to try and get that money through court. If it's a lot over, I'd highly recommend it. It just depends if it's somebody that you're going to go after personally, or if you're going to hire an attorney to do that. It just takes some time and some upfront money to do that.